Hello, puppies and kittens. We are speaking today with Phil. Skydive Phil is the channel you will probably know, and also Dr. Kenneth Williford, who is Associate Professor of Philosophy at UT Arlington. And we're talking about their published discussion of the problem of animal suffering. They have a peer-reviewed paper on that, and the link for that is below. And they've also met with a number of other philosophers to do a nice video discussion of the problem of animal suffering as an argument against God. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks
for having us.
So on this article, on your discussion, just real briefly, and I know we're going to get into it in just a moment, but you mentioned how the Bible visits excessive cruelty against animals. If I remember correctly, the Quran is not quite as bad, but the Quran also is bad when it comes to the regard of animals. But my take on it is that if we're not going to be the type of apologist who just flat out rejects all scientific evidence, then one of the things we have to understand is, one, humans are biologically animals. If there was a God, God could have created us with the ability to create our own food like plants do. But, so by design then, and even the Bible says so, that we have to eat, right? So he gave us all these fruit of all these trees that we can eat because we have to. So our existence depends on the ingestion and digestion of living cells, whether it's plant or animal or what have you. One way or another, death is required for our very existence. And that's a sad fact. But then prior to us, hundreds of millions of years of, I forget who said it, but nature read in tooth and claw.
I think it was Tennyson that said that, wasn't it?
Really? Well, I thought it's in Darwin. Doesn't he?
Okay, was he? I
thought it was Darwin too. I thought it was Darwin too. I was correct.
Yeah.
Okay, we should fact check.
So let's hear your take on it, if you don't mind.
Mine or Phil's?
Let's start with you.
Take on what?
The problem of animal suffering, the contradictions therein. And if you need me to flesh out my position a little bit more, I mean, I was raised by a family that they would process their own animals, they would butcher their own animals. My dad bragged that he hunted and killed more of his dinners than he bought because he lived in the bush in Alaska, and that was just the way at the time. But when I watched him processing an animal that was still visibly alive, I asked him about the suffering that the animal is going through, and he said, "It's just a dumb animal. It don't feel nothing."
Mm. Yeah.
Well, that is a view that has been held by Christian philosophers for a long time. So Augustine and Thomas Aquinas basically said that, maybe not in those exact words. But they believe that animals don't suffer. And in fact, they said they can infer this. And how do they infer it? Because in the story of Legion in the New Testament, Jesus exorcises demons into 2,000 pigs that then run down a cliff and drown. And from that, Augustine says, okay, this is teaching us a lesson. Pigs don't suffer. They don't have moral worth. And Aquinas said that. Descartes said that. Malebranche, another sort of follower of Descartes, was thought to have kicked his dog and said, a pregnant dog, I think it was actually, and said, you know what, it's just a machine. It doesn't have feelings. And even contemporary Christian philosophers, such as C.S. Lewis, the author of the Narnia books. I mean, I found this quite surprising that the author of the book about talking animals didn't believe that animals suffered. And most recently, we've had people like Michael Murray and William Lane Craig suggest that this is either true or in the case of Craig, or at least plausible in the case of Murray. And perhaps most well-respected Christian philosopher in the world, Richard Swinburne, has also made similar comments, not quite the same. He basically says he doesn't quite say all animals don't suffer, but rather they suffer less. So it's a very long tradition in Christian philosophy that animals, either don't suffer or their suffering is not of great concern.
Why then does this bird not just tear into me all the time? Why does he seek attention? Why does he want to be petted?
That's, God just made them to make you happy. This is kind of like the idea they, or somehow for some reasons we don't fully understand, they kind of we have to be fooled all the time or a lot of the time into thinking that they suffer and they behave exactly. They're kind of like philosophical zombies, something similar to that. I mean,
who came up with the idea of the philosophical zombie?
Well, it wasn't David Chalmers actually, but now I can't remember the ultimate origin of it. But David Chalmers made it famous. By the way, I was looking. It is Tennyson, Red in Tooth and Claw.
Yeah.
Right.
But
so I mean, anybody that's had an old dog, knows that dog is aware that it's in pain.
That's what it certainly seems like. It's real hard to convince yourself otherwise.
But if you have a powerful faith, then perhaps, well, not perhaps, for sure, you can convince yourself otherwise, because we know that Christian philosophers have convinced themselves otherwise.
It's a bit like, Descartes is sort of famous for arguing that there must be an external world because it would not be good of God to lie to us about that fact or perpetually deceive us about that fact. But then, it seems like animals suffer, so God made them so they look like they're suffering. Isn't that kind of like God lying to us? And then he thought, oh yeah, but we can correct it by reason, and we go through some arguments. This in the Discourse on Method he talks about, basically concludes that they don't reason. For Descartes, it seems to be about reasoning and their reasoning capacities, and if they were conscious, they would have certain reasoning capacity, which he thinks they don't exhibit. Which it's not the most rigorous test of animal reasoning, let me tell you. But
well, it's just prejudice, isn't it? I mean, that we just have to be the best. That we have to be the select. We are the reason. Remember that Christianity is so humble that they're convinced that we are the reason the universe exists.
Yeah.
Right.
Anthropocentric. But so Descartes thinks by reasoning we can come to the conclusion that we can correct our very powerful sense that animals suffer. But yeah, I guess he would say the sort of the pull, the basic, intuition that they still do it would persist, even though you've kind of corrected it. So I imagine the neo-Cartesians, the people, Christian philosophers like Craig and Murray, who think this, I'm sure they still, when they encounter animals, they must still sort of feel like they're in the presence of a conscious being.
Well, it's interesting. There's on William Lane. So William Lane Craig quite famously said in a debate with the atheist Stephen Law, that animals are not aware of pain, so we don't have to worry about animal suffering. And he says even though your cat or your dog may be in pain, it's not aware that it's in pain, so they don't suffer like we do. Now, what's interesting is on his website he talks about the death of his pet cat. I think it was called Muff, and Muff was looking like it was on its last legs, and they put the cat down. They said it was the most painful thing they'd ever have to do. So the question is why? Why was it so painful? Why did they do it? Now, presumably they did it because they thought the cat was suffering and had nothing left in its life other than suffering. In that sense, if that's true, if that was what their motivation was, it can be seen as a merciful act. But it does require that assumption that the cat suffers. So it seems like in their private life, they behave in one way, or at least Craig does. But in their published works, they're saying something completely different.
They could say something like, well, no, it just became, to be constantly confronted with this illusion of animal suffering got annoying. and we all started, it's like, yeah, don't worry, it's not really so, but it sure does look like it. So, and that gets kind of old, so maybe it's time to.
Yeah, we had a very old dog who she was on painkillers. I'm taking her to the vet to get painkillers, but eventually the painkillers don't. Why do they make painkillers for dogs? I'm assuming that they've tested these, and dogs on painkillers don't feel the pain like if they weren't on painkillers. So there's that. But then there was a point where the pain became more and more, and she's crying every night while she's trying to sleep. She can't get comfortable. She's got so many things wrong with her. Just compiled, as you age, you get compiled things. And so I remember taking her to the vet at one point, and I said, look, the painkillers aren't working anymore. She's still crying. And they run all these tests, and they said, well, wait, she's got this and this and this and this because she's a really old dog. But now she also has cancer. And I tell you, it was almost a relief to go over that tipping point to realize that, okay, we've done everything we can do, and now we're facing something we can't overcome. And so the solution best for all is that we just put her down right now. And as you say, it's painful, but it's also merciful. Yeah. And it does strike me that religious people are being a bit hypocritical on a lot of things, but when they talk about how they're going to be on this, they're in a better place now. Well, then why are you crying?
Well, yeah, I mean, wish they would say we miss their company and we but,
yeah.
Yeah.
The way a woman wails over the loss of her child is not because they miss their company.
I'm just trying to think of what they might
I want to just come back to this issue of the painkillers, because there's a very interesting experiment, or a series, I mean, there's many actually, but with fish, what they did was they looked to see where fish prefer in their tanks. So they might have an area with, enriched activities like plants and things for them to hang out in, and then a darkened area with just barren and nothing there. And then what they showed what the preference was for the fish, and clearly it was for the interesting part of the tank. And then what they did was they gave it an injection of bee venom, and it still preferred the interesting part of the tank. But then what they did was, in the uninteresting part of the tank, they put painkillers, and now they did switch. They switched to this sort of unpreferred area. That makes a lot of sense if they feel pain. It makes absolutely no sense if they don't.
Yeah, well, what they have to say is that animals have something in them that functions just like the pain system in humans, but without the experience accompanying it. That's pretty much what they got to say to try to make this agree.
But with all the signs of terror, nonetheless.
That's right. So it functions exactly the same way. They look like they're experiencing pain. Functions the way pain does, to make you avoid things or make you seek out things that alleviate the pain. But they're not experiencing any of it. That's what they're basically saying.
I mean, it's like a pain zombie, if you like.
Yeah, right.
So God comes up with this situation wherein we don't have a choice. At least not 100 years ago, it was not possible for I don't think anybody to be vegan at that point. 100 years ago, how could you? And so we are reliant upon animal processing. We didn't have synthetic materials and that sort of thing. So one way or another, we were reliant on animal processing throughout the entirety of human history. So our biology requires that we be cruel to these animals, and yet the animals have every indication that they know fear and terror. And that anything. Somebody explained to me that anything that can feel terror can also feel comfort. And this was an argument.
Terror is in itself a form of suffering. So
yes.
I would say that people in the past have been vegans. I mean, the Jains, for example.
Well, the Jains, as I understand it, at least yes, you're right, for some Jains, but there was a kind of a division, and some would use dairy products. you know. But they're
So for all these,
At least vegetarian at the Jains.
but yeah, the most serious Jains, practicing Jains, would try to be fruitarians.
right.
so all these snakes behind me, they all have a hide,
I
because
think.
it's one of the requirements when you have pet snakes that they have to have a place to hide. Now, being out where you can see them doesn't cause them any physical pain at all, but it adds to their stress level, because snakes instinctively want to be hidden until they feel safe in coming out. Like some of them are nocturnal or whatever, but when they're not on the hunt or whatever, then they want to stay hidden. And there's a number of health risks that come with being stressed. So we give them a hide. We give them a place to hide. You know, why should that be necessary if these conditions are not for that animal real? If the stress isn't real, the stress is evidently real, as is the pain, as is the terror. When it goes into a fight or flight response, it's not programmed. It's not a machine programmed to look like it's scared. It's genuinely scared.
But
Well, I think.
yeah.
Go on, Ken. Sorry.
I was just saying, in effect, that's what they're saying. They're machines programmed to look scared. Basically.
Yeah.
No, I know, and I realize you're not saying that. I'm speaking right now
I'm just saying
a
that.
bit frustratingly to the people who raised me, who said these heartless things.
Oh, okay.
Right. So I think it might be helpful to give a little bit more explanation as to the justification that contemporary Christian philosophers have used to try and justify this view. So Michael Murray and William Lane Craig and Richard Swinburne have focused on parts of the brain in the neocortex. So the claim is that this is the part of the brain that you need for, let's say, morally salient suffering. I mean, whether you need consciousness or what's called affect, which is the emotional component in this case of pain. These are the parts of the brain that they think you need. And the claim is that these are evolutionary recent parts of the brain. Now, that's true. Okay. The neocortex is the most recent part of the brain. And there are particular regions. So in the case of William Lane Craig, he focused on the prefrontal cortex in particular, and Michael Murray. Richard Swinburne has been a bit more accurate, actually. I mentioned the anterior cingulate cortex, another part of the cortex. So the claim is that this is the part of the brain that does the sort of emotional component of pain. It's called affect, like the word effect, but with an A in front. So affect in neuroscience refers to emotion, basically. So if you don't have the emotional component of pain, it's that sense of dislike, then your pain doesn't really matter. And so that's the claim. And what happened with us, this is where I think we have an interesting story to tell, is I was aware of these claims. Now, Ken and his colleagues had found a person, his name is patient R in the medical literature. He did not have these brain regions, the ones that they said you need for pain affect. Now, actually, it gets a little bit more complicated because Michael Murray had sort of said it's pain affect. William Lane Craig, quoting Michael Murray, said something slightly different. He said it was self-awareness that you need for pain, and they don't have self-awareness because they don't have these cortical regions. And Ken, probably you should pick up the story. Maybe tell us a little bit about patient R.
Well, but yeah, right. We should not forget that mammals do have these regions anyway.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So
yeah. So that it wasn't even true they didn't have it.
But they don't have these regions.
Yeah. So they do have.
Oh, go ahead.
No, go on, Ken.
I was just going to say, yeah, patient R had massive bilateral, both sides of the brain damage from a herpes simplex infection, herpes simplex encephalitis. Occasionally, that virus will attack your brain, and most people who have that type of encephalitis die because it's pretty serious. But it had knocked out the prefrontal cortex. It also knocked out the regions for memory, the hippocampus, and so on. So he basically couldn't form new memories. That was the main deficit that he got out of it. But it knocked out the anterior cingulate and the insular cortices, and he was plenty self-aware and felt plenty of pain, and was even hypersensitive to certain kinds of pain, hyperpathic pain, they call it. So,
and that's very important, because the argument is that pain is not widespread throughout the animal kingdom because it's focused on these recent evolutionary developments in the neocortex. However, and it is true that some of these regions do light up when you study people in pain, emotional pain in particular, in fMRI. So the question is, why does it light up? And if it's lighting up because it's causing pain, then maybe animals who don't have these regions don't feel pain. But there's an alternative explanation. I mean, there's a couple of alternative explanations. One of them is very interesting here, though. If it's what's going on, it's not that it's lighting up, not because it's causing pain, because maybe it's trying to manage the pain, trying to control it.
Part of pain modulation or management.
Yeah, sort of, exactly. So in that case, if you don't have that region, your pain will be worse. And actually, that is exactly what was found with patient R. His pain is worse than sort of normal people. That's not to say it proves that hypothesis is correct. There could be other explanations, but certainly it's very, very troubling for these Christian philosophers.
So I remember when I was a kid, I saw somebody had an iguana with a very long tail, and somebody goes toward the end of the tail and pinches that tail just to see if the iguana felt the pain. And the iguana reacted rather violently as they're pinching down the tail. And at the point where they're causing like maybe a separation of the last two or three caudal vertebrae. So, I mean, the lizard is demonstrating that it feels pain. Maybe not the same way that we do. Maybe it doesn't feel the consistency of the pain. Maybe it doesn't linger the way it does for us. But it clearly has the sensation of pain.
It certainly seems like it, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we do have to be a little careful, because the fact that you have a response to a noxious stimuli doesn't necessarily prove you feel pain. And the way that people study this is much more sophisticated and subtle than that. I mean, obviously that gives us a sort of prima facie case for it. But the way that people have studied these things, usually they have like maybe, I think, 8 criteria. You know, like if you have an injury, do you nurse it? Do you take anesthetics for it? Will you give up resources to take an anesthetic in the presence of pain? There's a whole bunch of criteria that people look at. And
well, would you mind covering that? Because I mean, in your paper and in the video discussion, you went on about making cocaine available to some animals that they could dose themselves, and I'd like to hear you explain that. I mean, I'm sure other people listening would appreciate that.
Well, go ahead. Like about cocaine, I don't remember. Did I talk about that?
I think we did mention that, but I think so actually, there's something more profound about self-dosing, because actually you don't need drugs for self-dosing, because what was done that we mentioned in the film, and this is very, very important, that you can send signals into what are called subcortical regions of the brain. So these are regions of the brain that are more primitive, shall we say, much more evolutionary ancient. And you can send signals into these subcortical regions. This was work pioneered by a guy called Jaak Panksepp, and he's known as the father of affective neuroscience and neuroscience of emotions. And if you send signals into these certain regions that they had discovered, you can literally generate raw emotions. So if you send a signal into the fear part of this, or the fear region, shall we say, the animal will show you a fear response. And it's actually been done in humans. Sometimes when they have brain surgery, they might stimulate these regions. And the person will say they suddenly feel afraid. Now, what's the really interesting part of the experiment here is not just that these same regions generate what appear to be the same emotions, but you can give the animal control over the stimulation. So this self-dosing, right? And what you find is that for emotional states that people tend to think of as positive, the animals will keep self-dosing those emotional states and even give up food and maybe even die from starvation, because they keep wanting to self-dose for these positive emotional states. And for negative emotional states, they always switch them off. So that, why is this important? Because what that tells you is that emotion, the generation of emotion, is likely driven by subcortical regions. And if it's driven by subcortical regions, then it doesn't depend on this neocortex. The neocortex might be doing the more higher level thinking about it. Yeah. So that's true. But the basic raw emotion is coming subcortically. And if that's true, then you completely reverse the argument from the Christian philosophers that pain is, recent phenomena, limited in scope. No, it's widespread throughout the animal kingdom.
Then it makes perfect sense that lizards, reptiles might experience it on that side. Yep. And then,
I find it remarkable that anybody could be in the company of a dog or a loving parrot like this, also very intelligent, and can be very affectionate. They like to be petted. They don't like to be scared. It's easy to scare a parrot, and they get angry when they get scared. They want you to control their environment, make them feel safe, these behaviors. There's no point in if there was a God, in making them artificial, in making a bird like this one just act as if it's scared. The only thing that makes sense is that it legitimately is scared. But then we are talking about people who rationalize the pigs going over the cliff to say that the pigs don't really feel pain, but they question whether the pigs feel pain, but they don't question whether demons exist.
Well, I guess if you're going to believe in a God, why not demons as well?
Why not? In for a penny, in for a pound,
Right.
Anyway, I saw I put links below for the discussion that you had with a number of other people, and I found that very interesting. And I also put a link down for where people, you're going to have to buy it or write to one of the authors to get access to the full thing from the link that I have. If you have another link where they can avoid that, please provide it and I'll share it. But I mean, I did find both to be very interesting. I'm still a little bewildered as to how anybody ever came to the conclusion that God would go through all of this to create the illusion that your dog loves you, for example. And one of the great advantages that we have, and the studies have shown, that we have over the other apes, the chimpanzees and such, is that we have a higher level of empathy. We are much better able to put ourselves in someone else's shoes, to understand their feelings. And this is even when we're talking about non-human animals. So chimpanzees only have a limited capacity to cooperate. They're more interested in their own self-interest and can't maintain the interest in somebody else's situation. Our dogs are extremely good at reading our emotions, and we have gotten very good at reading theirs. And it bewilders me how someone can have a dog and do as Descartes did, just discount its existence as if it's just a thing. It's just a biological machine.
Yeah.
What was the quote from Pierre Bell, Ken? Do you remember that?
Well, yeah. So Bale says...
Hey, we should probably explain who Bell is.
Right. Pierre Bale is one of my favorite figures in the whole history of philosophy. So if y'all haven't heard or read any Pierre Bale, I encourage you to track him down and do so. So Pierre Bale was a French philosopher living in exile in the Netherlands. At the end, I think he died in 1704. So he published this enormous book called The Historical and Critical Dictionary in, I think, 1697. And Pierre Bale claimed to be a Christian, but of course, he had reasons for doing that.
It was 1704.
Even if he wasn't a Christian. So there's an endless debate about whether or not he really was a Christian. But Bale says that, the Cartesian view about animals, like that animals are not actually conscious, don't feel pain, it sure is convenient for for the problem of evil. It sure does help us out. And he says that's probably why some people keep believing it, even though it's really hard to maintain belief in that when you see animals and you encounter animals. It's like, what's driving them? He says. Remember, he's supposed to be a Christian himself. What's driving people here is that this is just kind of where they're driven by the problem of evil, because whatever you make, and I actually don't think any of the solutions for human suffering really work, but suppose we granted that the soul making theodicy or the free will defense or any of these attempts to kind of get God off the hook for human suffering, suppose they worked. Well, you can't make them work for animals unless you end up saying, I mean, there are people who say it, like that animals are, their souls are being bettered too, and so on. But the Cartesian approach is it's tempting, because then it's like, oh, whew, we don't have to worry about that problem.
Maybe we should explain that in our paper we highlighted that the problem of animal suffering isn't really just one problem. We highlight 5 problems. So the first one is we call it the problem of time, and that's the normal one that people mention, which is that animals have been suffering for hundreds of millions of years before humans ever existed. So that's the problem of time. Now you could, if you want to be a young earth creationist, you could get rid of the problem of time, right? But you also have this problem of creation, like the means by which we got here are very violent. So not just evolution, but also mass impacts, catastrophes. If the dinosaur impact hadn't happened, if the Permian extinction hadn't happened, probably we wouldn't be here. So the question is also, why did God, if God used these methods to get to us, so if you're not a creationist and you're going to embrace the natural history of the earth and you're going to embrace evolution, as many, to be fair, many Christians do, and not just Christians, other religious people, then you have to answer, why did God pick these methods? They're very violent. So that's the problem of creation. We also have this problem of divine commands, that God commands the torture and slaughter of animals. So, for example, in the book of Joshua, there's 2 interesting stories. So one we mentioned in the paper, there's another that we don't. So the one we mentioned in the paper is God commands the Hebrew armies to hough the horses of their enemies. Now, I remember reading this and I didn't know what hough horse meant. And what it meant is to slice the Achilles tendon of the horse in battle. And of course, God, could have tranquilized the animals. He didn't have to command this, but he did. He commands the slaughter of the Amalekites, but not just the men, women, and children, but their animals too. The other story in Joshua that we don't mention in the paper, but because there's only so much room, but it's a story. I forget the person's name, but it's a thief within the Israelites, and God is angry that this person stole, so he decides to make an example of them, and he has them executed, but not just them, all their possessions, which included, if I think, also their family and also their animals. So he commands the slaughter of animals, and he also carries it out himself, with the flood and the plagues. A lot of people forget that in the 10 plagues, the first plague is all the water turns to blood and all the fish die. The 10th plague is the killing of the firstborn, but it's also the firstborn cattle. So he commands suffering as well. And then the last problem is, why is it that we are omnivores? God could have created us as herbivores. He could have done that. That would have potentially alleviated what's going on now, mass extinction event. So you could have solutions to the problem of animal suffering, like what's known as soul making, or there are various other potential solutions. The question is, what solution could you have that solves all 5 of these problems? And that's a real challenge. And the neo-Cartesian one, the view that animals don't suffer, it potentially would do it. So that's why you can see people are attracted to it.
There's one more problem that you guys didn't bring up, and that was in the 16th century there was a thing called the Catholic missionaries to the New World had the Valladolid debate, and this is where there was one advocate for Native Americans who was arguing that they were fully human. And he was contested by 4 other people who were saying that the Native Americans were not human. They were soulless, thoughtless, talking animals, in human guise. And therefore, since they weren't human and couldn't feel pain, then it didn't matter how incessantly cruel they were.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a similar thought line. I mean, I'm not sure you could blame that on the Bible, or
Well, I'm
on
not
the.
saying that's necessarily the Bible, but
Yeah.
Catholicism historically.
Well, Catholics, but it's not necessarily. I mean, to be fair, it's not necessarily inherent in Catholic doctrine to take that view. That would might
Well,
be a bit.
I would say of the Catholic, there was the one who was advocating for their humanity is also Catholic. So that's
right.
that's not necessarily what I'm saying, but I'm saying if you take the problem that anybody that is not human is soulless and therefore doesn't really feel pain, then now you have your excuse that you can be as excessively cruel as you want to be, and those missionaries were.
Right. I mean, in fact, it goes back to like Aquinas and Augustine, because Aquinas had this view. Well, Ken, you could probably explain it better than I can. There was the rational soul and the different types of soul that Aquinas has.
Soul, the sensitive soul, and the rational soul. These are kind of old Aristotelian ideas. Yeah. So the animals have a sensitive soul, but not a rational soul.
And that's what Aquinas used to justify cruelty to animals.
Is it okay? I'm not. You actually know that. I think you know that better than me. Aquinas.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I know. I definitely read it. In Aquinas.
I mean, it's kind of interesting because the scholastic they did think that animals felt pain. So the scholastics, I mean, it's the Cartesians who end up thinking that they don't feel pain because they're not conscious at all. Because if they were conscious, they would be able to reason. For them, consciousness and reasoning kind of go together. So if they can't really reason, then you don't really think, and if you don't think, you're not really conscious. That's the kind of Cartesian view. And of course, that's not true either. I mean, they reason plenty, right? But and
they do it non-verbally, which is quite a trick. Imagine how difficult it would be to reason anything if you didn't have an inner monologue, if you couldn't work things out in your mind by talking to yourself.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, language facilitates thought tremendously, right? But the Aristotelians, or the medieval Aristotelians, like the scholastics, as far as I understand it, they did think that animals suffer. They just thought, like, well, they don't really have the kind of souls that we have, so it kind of doesn't matter so much, or it's like it's less morally significant. I could be wrong about that. So somebody
you said the medieval.
I found a quote from Aquinas.
Oh yeah, read it
in the second part of the Summa, question 64. So all right, so open quotes. When we hear it said, "Thou shalt not kill," we do not take it as referring to trees, for they have no sense, nor to irrational animals, because they have no fellowship with us. Hence it follows that the words "thou shalt not kill" refer to the killing of a man. Dumb animals and plants are devoid of the life of reason, whereby to set themselves in motion, they are moved, as it were, by another, by a kind of natural impulse, a sign of which is that they are naturally enslaved and accommodated to the use of others. He that kills another's ox sins not through the killing of the ox, but through injuring another man in his property. Wherefore, this is not a species of the sin of murder, but the sin of theft or robbery.
I remember happening across a document that was written in the American South in the year that Abraham Lincoln and Charles Darwin were both born, and it described, African immigrant slaves. It described them in terms of livestock, as if they were non-human, and the document refused to describe them as human. It described them as dumb animals. So again, wholly justifying whatever inhumane cruelty you can visit or want to visit, because there's your excuse. They're not really human. We just turned them into zombies.
Yeah, no, that's right. I'm actually looking for this Pierre Bayle quote. Maybe you can find it more easily, Phil, that we started our paper with. But
oh yeah, I can find it. Hang on, give me a second.
I did find a passage. This is in Bale's dictionary. You can get it. There's a nice version of it, the Historical and Critical Dictionary, edited by Richard Popkin. Just selections. It's an enormous work, but it's in an article called Rorarius, which is about an obscure figure who argued that often animals behave more rationally than people. Right. So, which is kind of amusing. But he has a passage here where he says, let's see. So it's kind of in the context of like, why do young children suffer? Like, why do babies suffer? And if your principle is that nobody who's not guilty should suffer, right? So if you're like an Augustinian and you recognize, well, young children suffer, you might go like, well, if you're a Calvinist or whatever, you might go, well, original sin, or it's good. It's a Catholic doctrine. It's also a Protestant doctrine, and it's original sin. So babies suffer because they fell with Adam, or they inherited Adam's sinful sin nature, and so on, right? So it's not unjust for children to suffer. And then Bale says, this is a most evident principle. It follows necessarily from the ideas we have of the justice and goodness of God, right? That God would not mete out suffering to anybody who didn't deserve it. Right? It agrees with the immutable order, with that order from which we clearly conceive that God never departs. The soul of beasts conflicts with this order and overthrows these very distinct ideas. It must then be granted that the automata of Descartes, that is Descartes' view about animals, is just mindless
automatons. Yeah.
Favors greatly the principles by which we judge about the infinite being and by which we maintain orthodoxy. In other words, the whole issue here, and it kind of puts it in a nutshell, right? The whole issue here is gratuitous suffering. Suffering is not deserved. It doesn't play a bigger cosmic purpose. Animals seem to have it. Seem to be in.
And babies have it. And babies have it because we blame the victim.
That's right, because they must have sinned in Adam.
If it's something bad happened to you, you must have deserved it.
Right. So here's the other quote from Pierre Bell. We opened our paper with this.
Right.
It says, the facts concerning the capacity of animals were very much puzzled both the followers of Descartes and those of Aristotle. The former deny that beasts have souls, while the latter maintain that they have souls endowed with sensation, memory, and passion, but not reason. It's too bad that Descartes' view is so difficult to maintain and so far from being probable, for it is otherwise of very great advantage to the true faith. And this is the only reason that keeps some people from giving it up.
That's right.
I think the suspicion is that Pierre Bell, even though he claimed to be a Christian, really wasn't. He was just, this is kind of satire, He was basically, well, Christianity must be true, so So, what did you say about reason, Ken? It's like,
so basically his view is that any way you turn it, Christianity doesn't come out well when it's subjected to tests of reasoning and consistency and moral consistency and so on. So if you want to be a Christian, you should stop all this like apologetics. You should stop all this evidence, and you should just give up reason. And he said, and so that's what I'm going to do.
It's funny because there was a survey of Americans done in, I think it was Time magazine in 2006, and they were asked, if a scientific fact is discovered that contradicts the core tenets of your faith, what would you do? Would you deny the science, or would you give up your faith? And 64% of Americans said they would just deny the science, even though it was phrased as it was found to be a scientific fact. They would still say no, it isn't.
Well, what did William Lane Craig say on that exact thing? I think William Lane Craig and others have said that, if there's I wish I could remember the exact way that he phrased it, but if there is something that science has determined that it is contradiction with your belief, then the science is an error.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of the that's how we explain the young Earth creationists and everybody, creation science and so on. Everybody is like, nah, this kind of conflicts with. We take the Bible as axiomatic.
Yeah.
Not just
So
the Bible, but a particular for the young Earth creationists, a particularly narrow interpretation of the Bible. We take that as like axiomatic.
whatever we can prove to be true is the lie, and only the book of lies is true.
Yeah,
That's the way I read it, because a friend of mine, my best friend in high school, became an ordained Southern Baptist minister and the principal of a Christian school, and he had a plaque on his wall in his office that said that the Bible was the only source of truth in our world. Let all else be a lie.
yeah, that's a pretty. So once you've done that, then you're kind of forced to. If you're not going to reinterpret what the book means, and you're not going to give up the book, then when you confront things like this, you're just it forces your hand. So you end up having to accept wilder and wilder sort of theories.
Oh, interesting.
But it's the animals who can't reason.
No, according to Rorarius and Bale's dictionary, they're more rational than people.
I mean, what's interesting is that I do think that we atheists do have something in common with the young Earth creationists, because they both agree, or we both agree, that evolution is not compatible with a good God. And so, because, I mean, it just isn't, because it's such a violent process. Why would a good God use such a violent process to get to us?
They do.
So you basically have a couple of choices here. You either then say, yeah, it is incompatible, so I'm going to give up my faith, or I agree it's incompatible and I'm going to give up the science. The really tricky one is to try and make them compatible, which is, obviously a lot of Christians try to do. But let's at least say what we're arguing in our paper is that this is in the light of animal suffering is much more difficult to do, because you've got to now take it like the standard explanation from Christianity for why there's so much suffering in the world is the fall of man, right? But obviously, if animals have been suffering for hundreds of millions of years before man, then you're in bigger trouble than what you were before the discovery of animal suffering. And similarly, one of the interesting things is that Jesus, when he returns to life, he still eats fish. Yeah, in his new, wonderful, new heaven body. Now, if fish don't feel pain, where's the problem? There isn't one, right? That's fine. Jesus can eat fish. But if fish do feel pain, now this looks a lot more troubling. And it's only been in the last 20 years that actually people have just really found the scientific evidence that fish do feel pain. So these are new scientific discoveries, and they are very, very troubling for Christianity. And not
Well,
just
here's another one for you. Harkening back to my wall of snakes behind me. Recent studies, snakes have two penises, just like a lot of other lizards have. Most of them, they have a hemipene, so it's like one penis divides into two. And then there was a discovery that snakes have a similar complement, a dual complement of clitori. Why would female snakes have a clitoris if I mean,
right.
There's clearly there's clearly a pain and pleasure sensation thing going on here. That's what this was.
It's okay for them to feel pleasure. I mean, it would be weird though. I mean, here's a view that they haven't. I don't know why nobody has proposed this, but maybe they could say, no, animals just feel pleasure, and they don't. They look like they feel pain, but they don't really. But when they look like they're feeling good, they really are, and it's just God, like by hand, kind of like okay, no, turn off the part, whatever.
You know what? I have read a paper. I've forgotten who it is. The theologian suggests that just before an animal is, let's say, attacked by a predator, God does intervene and stops them feeling pain.
Hmm.
And that is the
Oh, you mean,
animal suffering.
yeah, I've heard something similar. There was an American senator who said that that women get raped, God intervenes to stop them from getting pregnant. And it doesn't matter how much data stands against that, because they don't have to. That's just facts.
Why God would allow the rape in the first place? You know,
Well, you've read the Old Testament, right?
free will.
Yeah, well, I remember the commandment against rape. It's commandment number. Oh no, wait a minute.
That's right. That's right. So I believe it was Numbers 31. I believe it's Numbers 31 where Moses criticizes his own people because they saved the women and children. So he demands that all of the women be murdered and all of the little boys be murdered, but the little girls specifically, if they're virgins, that his men can keep them for themselves.
It's just to protect them, obviously.
It
You know,
sounds like
it's a great moment of love.
it's not so different from, like, you know, episodes in the Iliad and other kind of Iron Age, Bronze Age things.
Yeah, but they're not teaching that in history class as fact.
That's right. You could
Well,
imagine
it's not whether it's fact or not, it's whether it's considered moral or not. I mean, that's the point. You know, some Christians will look at these passages and they'll say, well, these are metaphors, or they didn't really happen. And I have had that sort of response. These events didn't happen. You're taking the Bible too literally. You're like a young earth creationist, you know. Now, what my reply to that would be, okay, let's say these events didn't happen, and I think they didn't anyway, so I have to concede that. The issue is not whether they happened or not, it's the moral lesson that is encoded within it. So it clearly takes these events as being righteous, right? These are the good guys of the story doing this.
That's what it seems like, right?
Right. So it doesn't matter whether it is historical or not. I mean,
so yeah, King Saul gets in trouble for not killing the king of the Amalekites when he was commanded to, and for keeping didn't they keep some of the animals that they were supposed to slaughter?
Yeah, I can't remember. Basically, Saul was commanded to kill all of the Amalekites, including the men, the women, the children, and the animals. And he didn't kill everyone. I can't remember exactly who he kept alive.
He didn't kill the king.
He didn't kill the king.
Yeah.
And so that is why God got angry with Saul and replaced him.
Some of the choice animals.
Well, I think the way that they worked it out back then, and they made a popular board game out of it. You kill everybody but the king, and then you just say to the king, checkmate, and the game is over.
Except that's too merciful for the God of the Old Testament. Because he punished Saul for that very thing.
So even if it was a metaphor or what, not a literal story, it's kind of like Saul did the wrong thing by not fully obeying God, right? So it's kind of like the morality of it. If this is a righteous, that's what the point you were making, Phil. Right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, so when I read the passage that you just quoted about the Aristotelians holding the idea that animals had a soul and everything but reason, that was the first departure that I had from Christianity. The first one was the idea of hell, because hell is inconsistent with God. When I was a child and I was still a Christian, I had to reject hell because of its inconsistency with God. But then the other problem that I had with it was if anything alive has a soul, then everything alive has a soul. There would be no reason why people did and animals didn't. Yeah. And so I don't have to come up with the dividing line about whether Native Americans or whether our African slaves are human or not to justify excessive cruelty. I don't think the excessive cruelty is justified, even if I can come up with an excuse that maybe they don't really feel it, because it just sounds like a bullshit excuse to me.
Right. And to be fair, there are obviously, many theologians who have tackled this problem of animal suffering and not deny that they suffer. So a popular one is Trent Doherty, and he's very strong that animals do suffer. He concedes that very quickly, and he's very critical of William Lane Craig for this sort of motivated reasoning. But the solution that he comes up with is, well, I'll tell you what it is, and you tell me what you think. So his idea is that animals do suffer and they have souls, but they'll be compensated in the afterlife. But he concedes, and this is very important, compensation is still not enough for justification, right? The fact that I compensate you for harm still doesn't justify the harm that I did to you. So what he suggests is that animals will be transformed into talking creatures, kind of like Narnia.
Yeah.
They'll have the ability to reason. They're going to look back on their lives and go, yeah, I see that my suffering was all part of this wonderful, great narrative that God had in store for the world, and it was all worth it in the end. So I'm very thankful for my suffering. And that's the way he explains things.
So Descartes' dog gets to seek out Descartes and say, what part of God's plan involved you kicking me when I was pregnant?
Descartes didn't do that. So that was Malebranche.
Okay.
Descartes liked his dog, but he did perform vivisections.
Yeah.
In the name of science, is my understanding.
But I think the point is, Aaron, what I take your point is that these animals who were wronged, let's suppose the ones who were killed in the book of Joshua, when the thief was executed, they're going to look back on their lives according to Trent Doherty and say,
it was all part of the great plan. Yeah. So it's kind of applying the same reasoning to animals that you might apply, that they do to people sometimes. I mean, the whole your life was cut short, or you died as a soldier in a war that you were conscripted into, and your whole life potential was squandered. But no, that was just part of the big dialectical plan that God had to realize awesomeness. So you should just reconcile with reality and accept your place, accept your fate, and it's all good. This is the best of all possible worlds, or it's at least good enough. And we don't understand the plan, but once we do, we'll be like, oh, I see why that horrible thing had to happen to me. Why?
I mean, that actually, to be fair, probably the mainstream, I don't know if you think this is right, Ken, but probably the most popular way of dealing with the problem of suffering in general, and it kind of be applied to the problem of animal suffering, is what they call skeptical theism, which is a very strange term. But the idea is that we should be skeptical of our ability to see the world from a sort of God's eye view.
Yeah.
And therefore we don't know what greater goods are coming from these apparent bads. Yeah. And so we can't say that what we see is really, the suffering that we see is really gratuitous, because we don't know what greater goods might come from it. And so that is probably, do you agree, Ken, that's the mainstream view?
Yeah, I mean, in a way that's a part of a lot of different theodicy, I don't know how to make that an adjective, theodicy stories. A lot of them are involved that at some level, like even the free will one, because you have to suppose you think the free will story about humans and human justification of human suffering in terms of our moral decisions and blah blah blah, based on free will. You might ask yourself, like, what's so damn great about free will? What's so wonderful about it? Like, this is a capacity to do stupid things. It's a capacity to do immoral things. Like, why be happy about that? It's capacity to eat the fruit when I'm told not to and cause endless suffering for everybody. It's like crazy. So you have to think, well, it's for some reason or other, free will is like that we can't understand. Free will is so valuable that God is willing to, allow the fall to be unleashed, the consequences of the fall to be unleashed after the exercise of free will. It wouldn't be meaningful free will and so on. Like, well, what's so great about it? So you might think we don't know enough to rule out that free will is not this great thing or something like that. Like that God has reasons for allowing it that maximize some kind of value where it may not be obvious to us how and why. And then with the soul making one, it's kind of similar. Like, yeah, if our souls get made and animals' souls get made into something awesome through all of this veil of tears and sorrow, suffering ennobles us and so on.
So if we're one of the very few that get into the private party in heaven, that we're the very few that get past the doorman for that.
It better be
Uh,
everybody, or yeah, it better be
yeah,
everybody. It's not a good,
so I've heard some descriptions that we lose our free will when we get to heaven,
Yeah,
which would be
right.
coincidentally when animals gain their ability to reason.
Yeah.
And don't forget, I mean, free will has to be a sort of infinite good in these sorts of because it can justify any suffering. Well, no, free will. You can let a Holocaust happen. Well, free will.
Free will.
You know, it has to be like this unbelievably
So
valuable good.
what I'm trying to say is that even in theodicies like that, where you actually give some kind of positive story, and it's not just a negative thing, like you don't know that God doesn't have a good reason. Even for stories like that, you have to. You're kind of saying like, well, you don't know that this isn't a really valuable thing to God somehow, or you can't. There's a level of skepticism that's involved with respect to what God values and so on, because it's not obvious that that's a valuable thing. God somehow realizes that this is valuable enough to justify all this suffering. Well, that's not obvious to us. Well, how do you know that there's not this reason God has for doing it? So I'm kind of saying that God has mysterious reasons, even when it comes to theodicies, that's sort of makes a kind of sense. At least have a certain intuitive pull at the beginning. Is
Okay.
That
The way I like to phrase it is that the Lord works in delirious ways.
or like, yeah. Because at least for me, it's like it's just not obvious that like free will really is all that awesome.
All right, so we've come up on an hour now, and so I think we have to close out at some point. So, gentlemen, I'd like you both to make whatever closing comment you think would be appropriate here, and we'll go ahead and end it.
Go ahead, Phil.
Okay, so basically, what our paper does is to highlight that the problem of animal suffering is much worse than already it was, and it was pretty bad already, because there are other things that are not part of the discussion generally on animal suffering. So if you read a book like Michael Murray's, who is like one of the go-to guys in the Christian world on animal suffering, he doesn't really mention, the slaughter of the animals in the Bible. It's just not one of the things that they mention. Doesn't mention that, we are omnivores, but when we didn't have to be. He really just focuses on, the hundreds of millions of years, the problem of time. So the problem is a lot worse. There are many types of this problem, and they can be solved if it were true that animals don't suffer. But what science has discovered is that animals do suffer, and that's a really big problem for Christianity.
Yeah, and we are. I mean, on this whole theme of skeptical theism, they can always say there's some mysterious thing that we don't have access to or that we're missing that would account for all. But or they can interpret things away so that so I'm not. I guess what I'm saying is there are other ways they might try to get out of the problem, but when we talk about the enhanced problem, it's kind of targeting people who have a specific set of commitments, like to Judeo-Christian theism of a certain kind, and they accept that the Bible's, even if they don't accept that everything is literally true in the Bible, that it has a kind of moral content to it that isn't, but if somebody jettisons all of that, or so it's not, in other words, the paper's not meant to be the end of the discussion on all theodicies, all possible theodicies. So in the future, we plan to discuss the soul-making theodicy in more detail, and maybe some other attempts with respect soul-making one with respect to animals.
That sounds fascinating as well. And as far as continuing the discussion, do check the link below in the description for this video for the protracted discussion. That is not just these two gentlemen, but there's a handful of other philosophers involved in that. Phil, you make very good documentaries, very professionally done. So I've seen a number of your documentaries of late whenever I've had time to watch them. And it's a shame that you don't have more subscribers. So I want to promote you just a little bit for the work that you do.
Thank you. That's very kind of you. Yeah. Yeah. Cheers.
All right.
All right.
Thank you, everyone.
All right.
Thanks, Anne. Okay.